So, according to some of the recent statistics by the American Institute of Stress, approximately 33% of people report feeling extreme stress. 77% of those say that it affects their physical health, while 73% say that it affects their mental health. And I'm sure that nobody listening to this podcast or watching the video is going to deny that stress and burnout are huge issues that we're dealing with, especially in post-COVID times. So today I am extremely excited to share with you a conversation with Julie Lowe, whom I met through a mastermind that we shared together, where we're both looking to continue to grow and expand to bring you the best and the latest. And Julie is a certified life and success coach who has worked with women and entrepreneurs for a long time, helping them work through the burnout and the stress that we all experience, but that is extremely common also in entrepreneurs. So Julie, thank you for being with us today. I am so excited for this conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. Yeah, stress is a big problem.
Absolutely. And I don't think that there's any of us who can say that they have led a stress-free life, especially in recent times. So I know it's a very timely conversation, and I just appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And if you could start us off by telling us just how you got into this, how you got involved in working with people and helping them through their burnout and stress.
Yeah, so I've been in business for a long time, about 10 years now, and predominantly working with entrepreneurs. And I think that burnout and stress is just so prevalent in the field. It's one of those things where we will work 50, 60 hours to have our own business instead of going into an office and working for somebody else. We love what we do, but it takes a lot of work and it's a lot of ups and downs, right? So, my past focus with entrepreneurs was more around like the marketing and advertising side of things and how to grow your business and scale online. But in doing that work, I saw a lot of the behind the scenes of some really successful businesses, and even the people that are really kind of crushing it, they can't escape the stress, right? We all have stress. And then for me personally, anxiety has kind of been a lifelong struggle. I was like that worry-wart, like stressed out kid, so it's something that I've kind of always dealt with. And honestly, just thought like, is it like a personality trait? Because I was stressed out since I was a child. I really wasn't sure what to do about it. Felt like I had tried everything over the years, everything from meditation to medication. Nothing really helped. You mentioned the pandemic. Everything kind of came to a head in 2020 for me.
Oh, yeah.
I think it did for a lot of people. The APA says the stress is at epidemic levels.
Yeah.
So if you weren't stressed out before the pandemic, I think you probably are now. Most people are. And things just really came to a head with, I was probably working 50 hours a week before the pandemic, and then 2 kids at home, trying to do virtual school for a year. Everything, like I said, kind of came to a head. And so that's when I got to the point of like, I got to do something. Like, this isn't just affecting me. This is affecting my family, my work at this point. And so I kind of went on this like search for what's the answer. If I've tried all this stuff, if I've tried meditating and journaling and like daily practices and it's not helping, like, surely there's still a solution out there. So being the nerd I am, I really kind of like dove into the research. I didn't just go like, oh, I'll Google it. I joined this like 9-month-long certification and took all these classes and read all the books, and finally came out the other side figuring out like what was going to handle my anxiety. And just kind of chronic stress too, because while things really came to a head, like anxiety wise, like I said, can't really avoid stress as an entrepreneur, especially. So once I kind of figured out things for myself, that's when I was like, okay, I shouldn't have had to spend like thousands of hours and thousands of dollars to figure this out. Like, I really became passionate about getting this information to as many people as possible, because it shouldn't be that hard to figure out what to do about stress and anxiety. So that's kind of how I got here.
I agree with you. It shouldn't be that hard. And having been a teacher for over 2 decades, I witnessed firsthand how the anxiety levels in kids even
Yeah.
rose over the last, I don't know, decade or so. And especially since the pandemic, it seems like almost every kid I encountered was stressed out and anxious. And I just kept thinking, what on earth is going on? And it finally dawned on me that we are in a culture, and this is leading to the next question, right? We are in a culture that sort of glorifies this whole hustle culture, right?
Yeah.
So do you see any relationship also between that hustle mentality and the levels of anxiety and burnout we're experiencing?
I think for sure. I think we have these big expectations for ourselves that we want to live up to, that we've put on ourselves. And then also when you see other entrepreneurs, getting $1 million months and things like that, you're like, okay, if I just work harder, I can make it happen. And so, a lot of us, we just think that if we just do more and more and more, that's kind of like the key to success, but we end up burning out because it's too much. And you can hustle for a while, but it's not sustainable. So I do think like there has been that glorification of that hustle and grind culture. I think people are pushing back from it a little bit more now, but it's a habit, right? Like we're so used to behaving in a certain way, especially if you've been in business for a while or that's just how you've always operated. It can be hard to kind of back out of that. And like you said, I mean, it's affecting everybody, even our kids. A lot of what I learned, I have a 10-year-old, I use it with him. He has ADHD, and ADHD and anxiety tend to go hand in hand. And so especially during the pandemic, that anxiety went up. So yeah, it's great to find practices that you can use for yourself, but they're also so simple that even a child can use them. Yeah.
Awesome. Now, we are going to be using a few terms throughout our conversation that have become in vogue, right? Everybody's using them, everybody's talking about them, but I think sometimes we throw them around without really understanding what is behind the concepts. So I think it would be important to take a couple of minutes to define key terms like burnout, anxiety, and stress. Would you mind walking us through that for a minute?
Yeah, for sure. So stress and anxiety, a lot of times we use them interchangeably, and I think you can. I mean, for the most part, though, anxiety would be more of that mental process, whereas stress is more of a body process, right? So stress is basically a nervous system response that you're having, where your body's sending you into fight or flight. I kind of use them interchangeably, but I would say if you wanted to split them out, I'd say anxiety is more of that mental side, where stress is more of like that physical reaction that you're having to a stressor in your life, something that's sending you into high alert. And then burnout, technically speaking, it's kind of classified as something related specifically to work. So it's chronic, prolonged stress that it gets to the point where you just can't cope with the capacity of that you're trying to keep up with. So it's like mental, physical, emotional overwhelm over a long period of time. And burnout, when you read the description, it's like all of the symptoms of stress, plus it almost reads a little bit like depression, because it's talking about being like really checked out, where you get kind of cynical about your job, and you kind of pull back and pull away because you can't keep up with the load. And technically speaking, burnout is tied to your work.
Okay, awesome. Now, something that surprised me when I was preparing for our interview is I was doing some research on stats, like the ones I read at the beginning of our conversation. And it surprised me to find that people who work remotely from home are experiencing higher levels of burnout than the people who actually show in the workplace. I found that really surprising.
I think it can be a bit because of the isolation part right now. Like I've worked from home for like 9 years now. My husband's been at home even longer than me. It's probably closer to 15 years. And so some people are used to it and they thrive in that environment. For a lot of people, though, it can be really isolating. And one of the problems with stress and burnout is that you tend to pull back and pull away. I was really guilty of this. Like, the best thing we can do is lean in and get support. But a lot of us, stress has really been kind of like vilified. And I actually read a headline one time that stress is contagious. And is like, secondhand stress killing you? And when you hear things like that, like you immediately think like, oh, I don't want to like infect anyone, right? I should pull back. I should pull away. I shouldn't share my worries. And a lot of us, we don't want to feel like we're burdening people.
Yeah.
But actually, like, the best thing you can do is to lean into support. But it is so common for people to pull back and pull away and to self-isolate. I actually did a small little survey recently of my audience and asked what they were struggling with and how they were coping. And I was actually surprised by how many people said, you know what, I'm not hanging out with my friends as much. I feel really disconnected from my partner and I'm isolating a lot. And I think that's really common. And then when you're at home and you don't have like the water cooler conversations, you know, if you're in an office and you don't have those people that are touch points throughout your day to have casual conversation, can be harder on Zoom. I think that's really kind of what's leading to it, especially if somebody is a little bit more introvert or extroverted rather, and they want that contact. But even introverts like me, we need that human contact, right? We need the social aspect.
Now, I don't know if you found this too, but I've found that in many conversations after things started normalizing post-COVID, a lot of anxiety was actually stemming from having to go back to those interactions, right?
Yeah, because you felt out of practice, right? So a lot of us stayed home for a very long time, whether it was required by the country you live in or not. So then it became really kind of difficult of like, gosh, I haven't had that casual contact, that casual conversation for a while. And I think we got out of practice. And so whether you were worried about from the health aspect of like getting COVID from being in person, or just like the social anxiety of like, I feel really out of practice, I haven't hung out with people in a while. I think that was really common for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Now, in your experience, do you find that there's a difference between how women are affected by burnout and stress versus men, generally speaking? And I know we're going to be generalizing in this conversation, but just from your experience.
For sure. I do. I mean, the statistics say that women tend to be a little bit more prone to burnout than men. Gen Z as a generation is a little bit more prone to burnout as well, which I found interesting. Now, nobody escapes it, but women, I think in particular, are prone to burnout because we put on so many hats, right?
Yeah.
Again, we're generalizing, but a lot of women are the ones that are in charge of like the stuff for the kids and running the household for the most part. You know, my husband helps out a ton.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot of things that like you just kind of take on as the mom, right? Yeah. And then also like the reality is, especially in a workplace, we have to kind of like go above and beyond sometimes to kind of stand out in a role. And so women are just used to, I think, kind of doing a little bit more, taking on a little bit more. And again, generalization, but just like really having that emotional impact of carrying all that. So women are, I think, a little bit more prone to burnout.
Yeah, and I think too, we are used to having to keep it all together, right?
Yeah.
Which leads to the next part of our conversation, because we tend to feel like if we rely on other people or we comment on how stressed we are or we share how burnt out we feel, then we're dropping the ball, we're doing something wrong, we're not being who we're supposed to be. But you have a different approach to this whole stress thing. So I would love to dive into that right now if you're okay.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that really, really shifted stress for me was really kind of rethinking my relationship with stress. Like I said, we read these headlines, you know, and it's always negative, right? Like stress is killing you, it's contagious, it's like, right, it's all this stuff. So for me, especially struggling with anxiety all my life, I really just thought it was something wrong with me. Like this is a bad aspect of my personality or something, right? Super sensitive. Like I just need to toughen up and like keep it together. Definitely kind of came from that background of like, okay, you got to keep it together. And so when I learned, number one, that stress is a nervous system response and that stress happens in your body first and foremost, that was huge for me because it wasn't like, oh, this is just a mental game and I need to toughen up and think better thoughts. And like, why can't I do that? Like, I'm smart. Like, why can't I just like control my thoughts better? And when I learned it was really like a physical response is like, oh, that's why, right? Like my body is responding before my brain can because our body sends more of those signals of threat to our brain than the other way around. And so number one, that really shifted things for me of like, oh, this isn't just something literally in my head. It's something happening in my body and my body is trying to keep me safe. Number one. And number two, whenever I realized, you know, stress doesn't have to be this scary thing. And it's not our body like betraying us. I think a lot of times when our heart starts pounding and our palms start sweating and stuff, we think like, oh God, like my body's betraying me, and like I need to get it together, and I got to calm down. And I think I wasted so much energy trying to calm myself down. And when I realized, okay, yeah, my body's responding, and that's what it's supposed to do, and that's perfect. And there is a way to channel that energy and use it to your advantage. And it's not that anything's wrong. It's not that you're about to bomb or anything like that. You know, if you're under pressure, that you can actually channel that energy, and your body's trying to do you a favor. And so when I realized, like, you know what, stress is not the enemy. Stress is not something that I need to get under control and you know, strong arm it into submission. It's really my body trying to help me and protect me, and it's doing what it's supposed to do. And it's not necessarily a bad sign. That really changed everything for me, because knowing that nervous system piece helped. But then when I stopped trying to tamp it down, and just use that energy my body was giving me more as like fuel, that's what really, those two like components together, that's what really shifted things for me.
That's awesome. And I'm glad you're mentioning this. And we're going to come back to that idea of using stress as fuel. But I think there are so many issues that we deal with that have to do ultimately with our mental and emotional health, right? That have been stigmatized in some way. Like if somebody came to you and said, my leg is in pain and it's inflamed, you wouldn't say, oh, get over it, calm down.
Yeah.
You would say, okay, let's figure out what's going on and let's try to fix it.
Yeah.
Or let's figure out how to use this to diagnose whatever, to figure out what our next best steps are, right? But when it's anything that it's not palpable like that, right? Anything that we can't associate with a physical illness, we tend to say, oh, just get over it, just deal with it. And that is still, unfortunately, part of the stigma that we're dealing with, which actually exacerbates the situation, because here you are already not feeling 100% the way you want to feel. And then you have all these cues telling you, just get over it. It's all on you. It's your fault. Deal with it. Which makes it even worse, right?
It really does. And I felt like I carried a lot of like guilt and shame around it, of like, what is wrong with me? Why can't I fix this? I mean, I would cry in between calls and meetings and then pull myself together so that nobody knew that I was struggling. And I think that's so common. And it took me a long time to really seek help, because I just felt like I should be able to handle this. Like I should be able to figure it out. And so I finally went, and it's so funny because like I wouldn't tell a friend that, right? Like it took me so long to like get help and to go to talk therapy. And I was on medication for a little while in 2020. And if a friend had come to me and told me, this is what I'm going through, I would have been like, see a doctor now. Like I would have sent them to their doctor. I would have sent them to a therapist. But it's so funny. Like we hold these different standards for ourselves. Even if we don't personally have like a stigma around like people going to therapy, it can be hard because we've internalized this stuff. And I just don't think we talked about this stuff, you know, in the 80s and even the 90s, of like, everybody should probably be going to therapy, honestly, and that there should be no stigma around it. But unfortunately, it's just not how we view these things. So yeah, we can have a lot of guilt and a lot of shame around it, even if intellectually we know at this point that there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah. And this is outside a little bit of the scope of our conversation, but I just thought I'd bring it up because I think you have a lot in common with me in the way we were raised, where our way of being a good kid actually promoted all of this anxiety and all of this stress because we wanted to do the right thing, because we wanted to get the good grades, because we wanted to please the adults around us, the important people of authority in our lives. And I think that's shifting a little bit. I think that as parents, we're starting to understand that love is love, and we get to offer it because they're our kids and because they are who they are, not based on any performance markers, right? But so many of us are still dealing with that pressure of performing a certain way, and we don't identify that as the source until we get the help, until we go forth and do the work to go in and see where it came from. And that helps a lot. So I just wanted to go on that little tangent for a minute, because I think a lot of us don't recognize it.
I think so too. And I think it's so hard to see your own stuff, right? So that's why I'm such an advocate for therapy, for coaching, like whatever you want to access, but just having that outside perspective, because especially if it's just something, well, a lot of our stuff is from the way we were raised, no matter how great our parents are, right? It's childhood stuff. But without that outside perspective, you don't realize like what you've internalized. I know for me, I mean, my parents are great, and they would tell me like, well, just do your best. As long as you do your best, it's fine. And I somehow internalized that as like, that means strive and do like work really hard, like all the time. Right. So like we can twist
have to be the best.
Around, you know, yeah, it's like we can twist things around. Even if my mom was trying to say like, it's okay, you don't have to get straight A's. In my head as a child, it was like, well, that means you better work really, really hard to do your best. Right. So, you know, even if our parents have great intentions and you know, we could still like get this stuff twisted around. And then, yeah, if we don't have another person reflecting back to us, or we don't really dig into this stuff, we don't realize sometimes what's driving us. And then, you know, you can't shift it unless you know.
And it's not a matter of blame. I mean, blaming doesn't help anything. It's understanding, right? It's being aware. Because I have this saying that I say all the time, nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, how am I going to make somebody miserable, right? It's not intentional, but we do things sometimes unintentionally, especially as parents and as spouses that affect the other person. But going back to our conversation, you mentioned using stress as fuel, and I want us to really dive into what that looks like and how we can start doing that.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, when I learned about nervous system regulation techniques, that really helped. And the beginning of my journey was about like, okay, how can I calm my system and get it back to a regulated state? And that is really, really powerful. But then the other aspect, like I said, is using it as fuel. And I think probably the best example, and I know you do speaking coaching. And so it's like the great example is for a lot of us, we're really scared of public speaking. It's, you know, like the most common fear people have apparently. And, you know, it's such a great example of like, you know, you can be standing backstage or waiting to get onto a presentation and your heart starts pumping and your palms start sweating. And like I said, you start to think like, well, something's wrong. And this is a really bad sign. And I used to believe that. And so I would try to calm myself down. That's very difficult to do. And so it usually ended up just being this battle of like any sign of stress felt like a red flag, like something's wrong. And like, I'm not doing good enough job. Right. And it's going to be a disaster. But when I realized, oh, I can actually channel it and see it as energy my body's trying to give me, it really changes the story that you have in your head. And it changes the way your body reacts, right? Because if you're just trying to clamp everything down and then you're just making yourself more upset, then things probably aren't going to go well. But if you instead you tell yourself this story of like, oh, my body's giving me energy so I can focus and so that I can perform well, whatever it is, whether it's walking out onto a stage or if you're in sports or even taking a test, you know, even things that you think like, oh, I need to be calm. It's not that you necessarily need to be calm. You just need to channel that energy and that focus, and it can help you perform. I mean, they even say that surgeons, it's not that they're calm under pressure. It's that they have a different response where they're channeling that energy. They call it a challenge response. And it's very similar vibe to fight or flight, actually, but it's like a more focused energy where you don't feel threatened and you channel that energy. So that really made a huge difference for me, because now, you know, especially when I started talking about stress, and I'm like, God, this is not good. Like, I can't calm down. How am I talking about stress and I can't calm down? And I was like, oh, that, like, when I figured out that piece of like, oh, because I'm using the wrong tool, right? I was trying to use the tool, a calming tool, when in a moment of performance, you actually need energy. So that was really big for me. So I still get nervous, and then I just tell myself, well, that's okay. It's, you know, it's my body trying to help me out here. But it's amazing. There's even tons of studies on this where they purposely stress people out in a lab and then check their performance. They call those social stress tests. And they have found, even for people with anxiety disorders, if you have this belief that stress can be used as fuel, stress can actually help your performance, it really does help you perform better. And it actually protects your body from some of the physical harm that we relate to stress, which is fascinating too, that even your blood vessels react differently when you change this mindset.
Absolutely. I work a lot around questions, and I'm just wondering your opinion on this. Because one of the things that I teach my students is when you are starting to become aware of those feelings, of those emotions, of those things bubbling up, ask yourself two questions. The first one is, what else can this mean? And the second one is, how can I use this? Right.
Yes.
So you were talking about the nervousness and all that. I often joke around that when you're in love, you feel pretty much the same thing, right? The clammy hands, the beating heart, all those things. You feel pretty much the same thing in your body, but you interpret it as something different, right? So if you
Right.
can start asking yourself, okay, what else can this mean? Right now,
Mhm.
I'm interpreting it as being scared. Can it actually mean that I'm about to do something amazing? Can it actually mean that I'm about to change lives and I take that seriously? Can it actually mean, and then how can I use this, which is what you're talking about, fueling my
Yeah.
actions based on this new interpretation of the information?
For sure. And it's funny because we do that for other circumstances. Like a lot of people that play sports, for example, they'll just say, oh, I'm hyped up. Like if you see like kids before a football game or something, they're bouncing off the walls where they're having a bit of a stress response, but they're
Yeah.
telling themselves like, oh, I'm pumped up, but I'm going to do really well. We can do the same thing, whether it's a speech or a test or something else. We just have to, shift our mindset around it, like you said. So yeah, I love those.
That's
Love those
awesome.
questions.
Now, before we wrap up, and this has been absolutely outstanding, so I thank you again, Julie. But before we wrap up, I'd like to always leave my listeners and my audience with one actionable thing that they can start trying to implement today. So, what would you leave us with that it's something actionable that we can start paying attention to and doing?
Well, I think the most important thing, like I said, is to start shifting your mindset around stress. So rather than like something to kind of calm your nervous system, I would say take today's conversation forward and then start noticing how you think about and how you talk about stress with others. Because the first way that we can shift our mindset around stress is to start noticing it, because sometimes we just say things without thinking about like, oh, I'm so stressed out, this is so much pressure or whatever. So start noticing like how you speak about stress and when the stories that you tell yourself, and then also how do you react when other people around you share that they're stressed. Do you pull away? Do you commiserate and it becomes a contest of who's who's more stressed out? Like, how do you speak about it? Because how you speak about it really matters. And if you can start bringing awareness to it, that's kind of the first step to starting to shift your mindset around it. And literally just shifting your mindset around stress can have a huge impact.
That is awesome. And that brings up something else that we don't have a lot of time for, but I just wanted to mention that sometimes we don't even call it stress.
Yes.
Sometimes we call it
Yeah.
something else. So like you said, it's really important to start bringing awareness to the words that we use around it so that
Yeah.
we know that. I know for me, for instance, whenever I'm stressed, I say I'm frustrated. And it's not
Mhm.
frustration, it's stress. And when I
Yeah.
really come down to it, that's what it is. But I refuse to call it stress because of all these other negative things I have going around stress. But I'm putting the same energy into using the word
Mhm.
frustrated. So that's
Yeah.
really interesting that you mentioned that. I hadn't really put two and two together until I was listening to you talk. That's really
Yeah.
cool.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, think about the words and then also think about those feelings in your body, because if, like you said, if you're like getting a little angry or you're all tensed up or something like that, those can be signs of stress in your body too. Like I always think about fight or flight and how that shows up in your body, right? You're tensed and ready to run, or you're a little snippy and you're overreactive. Those are all stress responses.
That is outstanding. Well, thank you so much, Julie, for spending time with us today. Anybody who's interested in learning more about you and the work you do, where can they find you? What's the best way to connect?
Yeah, my website is sociallyaligned.com, and on Instagram, I'm Coach Julie Lowe.
That's awesome. So make sure to connect. She puts out a lot of great content and she is absolutely outstanding, as you have seen. Thank you again for your time. I know you have a million things going on, so thank you for being with us today, Julie. It was outstanding. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I want to sincerely thank you for joining me in this conversation today with Julie Lowe. I know you found tons of value in what she had to share. Now, if you want to dive deeper into this whole idea of how to get over the stress and the anxiety and the fear surrounding speaking in front of others, make sure to head on over to marcyamaro.com, where you will find all the resources that I have on there free information, and an invitation to a free workshop called the Speaking Confidence Catalyst, in which I will walk you through the steps of going from imposter and fear-filled to confident, bold, and authentic in front of any audience so you can leverage any stage. Until next time, I'm Marcia Amaro, and this has been Sincerely Speaking.